This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 940 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. The best part about last week's Sleeper Show was probably me calling out Ray Davis, who scored 17 PPR points. There were a lot of just okay performances, but not great ones aside from that. Like Noah Brown was a good deep sleeper. We had Sterling Shepard get about 11 PPR points. Xavier Legette scored 14, and Bo Nix was fine at 18. But the other two quarterback streamers in Derek Carr and Joe Flacco didn't really cut it. Zach Ertz got owned in a tough matchup, Trey Tucker got a lot of cardio, and Xavier Hutchinson did absolutely nothing. It was a hard week. I talked about that on the show. But I feel like the last few sleeper shows have been kind of underperformers. I'll do my best to turn things around this week. Now, before getting to those sleepers, I want to remind you that even though you drafted your fantasy teams back in August, you can still do snake drafts right now over on Underdog. Just head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the app. In the draft section, click NFL. You'll see tons and tons of drafts that you can participate in right now. And if you're new to Underdog, make sure you sign up with promo code LATEROUND. That'll get you a nice deposit bonus as well as my rest of season rankings. Those rankings are updated for you each Tuesday once you get the link to them. But to get them, you have to sign up, use promo code LATEROUND, make a deposit, and start playing. We'll kick things off with players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues, and we'll go to quarterback and start with Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers gets the Cardinals this week in a game where the Jets have a respectable 22.5 point team total. Arizona is the 11th best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. And this is the one game this week with the best pressure rate advantage. The Jets have been pretty good at limiting pressures this year. The Cardinals have been a bottom 5 team at generating pressure. That could give Aaron Rodgers a whole lot of time to beat this defense. He's averaged over 17 points per game over his last 4. I think he can get over that again this week. Now, I talked about how people have sort of had this anchoring bias with the Washington defense this year. That secondary has been much better versus how they started the year. It's a pretty average matchup now in total. But I should say, quarterbacks against Washington are throwing for 36 more yards than their average. I do think Russell Wilson can still work. Before the Steelers' bye, Wilson had scored 25 and 14 points in his 2 starts. He's been pushing the ball down the field more than Justin Fields was. That's led to an ADOT that's over 2 yards higher. Washington's been pretty average at defending those throws this year, those deeper throws. It's an average to above average matchup, but the game has an okay enough total, so I think that Russ can work. Now, there's an easier matchups argument to be made with Daniel Jones. Dimes gets Carolina, a team that really doesn't get to the quarterback that much. And it's one that's allowed the 3rd most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks adjusted for strength of opponent. Jones has the ability to give us 50 yards rushing in a game. And the Giants actually have a team total over 23 points. So he's a good streamer. Now, moving on to running back, I'm going to go back to that Pittsburgh matchup and talk about Jaylen Warren. Najee Harris has taken over this backfield, or he had before the bye. But Warren has seen back-to-back games with at least a 32% running back rush share. And he's hit target shares of 13%, 11%, and 11% over his last 3. They're using him. They're just using Najee Harris more. Washington's an average matchup on paper, and they do tend to limit targets to running backs. But Warren is seeing more work, and he could see more if this game script goes south for Pittsburgh. That's always possible. So he's an okay sleeper. And I'm going to go back to Tyler Algier. I feel like I talk about Algier every single week. He and the Falcons get the Saints, and New Orleans has been a top 10 matchup for running backs this year by adjusted points allowed. Algier, as we know, he's seeing between 25% and 50% of the team's running back rushes most weeks. And this week, the Falcons have a legit shot to face a positive game script given all of the Saints' issues. So Algier is a fine option. I'm going to go back to Ray Davis this week too. He keeps seeing backfield shares in that like 23 to 30% range, which isn't super high, but as he proved last week, once again, he can generate some big plays. Buffalo faces Indianapolis, and Indy not only is a top half matchup for running backs, but they've allowed a running back rushing yard margin of plus 18 yards this year, meaning team running backs are rushing for 18 more yards against them than they are an average opponent. That's a higher than normal rate. So if Buffalo hits a positive game script, definitely possible in this matchup, there's a chance that Ray Davis would benefit. Now moving on to wide receiver, the 49ers are back from their bye, which means you could look at Ricky Pearsall this week. I know he hasn't been amazing in his 2 games without Brandon Ayuk this year, and Jawan Jennings should be back this week too. But Pearsall should have a role that sees him get maybe 70%, 80% of the team's routes run. And he's seen target shares of 16% over his 2 games. The 49ers get the Bucs. Tampa Bay has been a top 6 matchup for wide receivers this year by adjusted points allowed. And San Francisco is projected to score a lot of points this week. And the Bucs rank first in neutral script pass rate against. So I think he's in a decent spot. Xavier Legette is once again a worthwhile sleeper. The Panthers face the Giants, kind of a below average matchup across the board, but it's okay enough. The thing is though, Legette has target shares of 21% and 25% over his last 2. He hasn't fallen below 11 PPR points in 3 of his last 4. Just based on usage, he's not a bad look. Now, I don't know how much Deontay Johnson is going to end up playing this week, but it's a Thursday night game. He only has a short week to improve on a low snap count. That's why Rashad Bateman still might work. Bateman has run the majority of his routes on the perimeter this year, and Cincinnati, his opponent, has seen targets go to the outside at the 3rd highest rate in the league, and that's adjusted for strength of opponent. It could be a higher scoring game, and Bateman's coming off a game where he saw a 21% target share. Now, I don't absolutely adore this spot, but he could make a big play or two. Ray McCloud was featured on the 15 Transactions episode, so I'm going to call him out here too. He's in a decent matchup against the Saints. The Falcons have a high implied team total. The Saints haven't been great against the slot. He's never finished a game this year with a single-digit percentage target share, and Drake London is banged up. As a result, Ray McCloud, he's a sleeper. Now, if Gabe Davis goes this week, I don't mind his spot. That's as long as Trevor Lawrence does too. That's up in the air right now because of a shoulder injury. But the Jags get the Vikings, and the Vikings are the 3rd best matchup for wide receivers by adjusted fantasy points allowed this year. They're allowing 62 more passing yards to be thrown on them versus the league average. You could throw Parker Washington in here too. If Trevor Lawrence plays, both of them are reasonable sleepers. Now at tight end in this tier, I have a handful of them for you. First is Zach Ertz. People may be turned off by his week 9 performance, but the Giants have been legit against tight ends this year. This week he gets Pittsburgh. The Steelers, not as legit. They're a top 10 team for tight ends by adjusted points allowed. They're top 5 in adjusted target share allowed. We know that Ertz will get his routes. In this matchup, he can convert those to production. Mike Gesicki was featured on the 15 Transactions episode, and like I said on there, as long as T. Higgins is out, Gesicki's in great shape. He's seen a target share per game rate above 19% without T. Higgins. It's been 5% with him. And now Eric All is out. That's going to lead to a higher routes run floor. Gesicki gets the Ravens, who are average against tight ends in adjusted points allowed, but they allow a ton of passing volume and a ton of passing yards, the highest marks in the league. So I think he's a fine streamer. Taysom Hill saw season highs across the board last week, as I talked about in the 10 Trends episode. A strong 16-point outing. If that usage improves, which is very possible, he shouldn't have much trouble against the Falcons. And then finally, Jonnu Smith. The Dolphins face the Rams this week in a game where Miami has a 24-point implied team total. The Rams are the 12th best matchup for tight ends by adjusted points allowed. And Smith, get this, he's seen target shares of 26%, 31%, 16%, and 22% over his last 4. He's been heavily involved in this offense, so you can stream him. We don't have any streaming quarterbacks in the deep tier this week or players rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues. So let's move on to running back, and I have one of them for you, Cam Akers. This is purely a game script and matchup thing. Akers operated as the clear number 2 back for Minnesota this past week, handling 22% of the team's running back rushes. He saw a 6% target share too. They get the Jags. They're 4.5-point road favorites. If things go their way, he may get more work, and that could lead to a reasonable fantasy day. Now, at wide receiver, Sterling Shepard's still under that 10% mark. He gets San Francisco, a team that ranks slightly above average in adjusted slot target share allowed. In week 9, Shepard ran about 70% of his routes out of the slot. The 49ers aren't an especially great matchup on paper, but teams are generally throwing on them in neutral game script environments. And this game could go south for Tampa Bay. They're 5.5-point underdogs. That would lead to more passing and more Shepard. He's probably an even better play if Jalen McMillan doesn't go, because last week he had a 16% target share without McMillan. If McMillan does go, we'll downgrade Shepard a bit. If T. Higgins is out, then Andre Josivas is a great play this week, within context. In games without Higgins, Josivas has had a route share of about 92%. That's 75% with Higgins. The Ravens, like I talked about earlier, they're a team that faces a lot of passing. That's resulted in them being the absolute best matchup for wide receivers according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. So I wouldn't be surprised if Josivas has a usable week this week. No player ran more routes for the Saints last week than Mason Tipton. I'm assuming Chris Olave won't be able to go this week after another concussion, so I'd also anticipate Tipton playing a lot for the Saints. And he gets a Falcons team that's given up the 10th most adjusted fantasy points to wide receivers. He's a very deep dart throw, but he's at least getting run. And then in that same game on that same team is Juwan Johnson. His target share wasn't fantastic last week at just 7%, but he did see an uptick in route participation, getting up to 73%. That's not surprising given all their injuries. The Falcons aren't really good or bad for tight ends, but Johnson should see enough work to work out. And the final player in this tier is Theo Johnson. Johnson gets Carolina. The Panthers are the best opponent for tight ends this year by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Meanwhile, Johnson's consistently been running in the 80% route share range. He had a 23% target share last week, so he might have another decent game in him. Now at defense this week, I talked about the Giants on the 15 Transaction Show earlier in the week. They definitely work against Carolina. And then my other one would probably be Atlanta against New Orleans. That's a lower tiered play though, because I'm a little bit concerned about how much pressure the Falcons can actually generate. And then finally, we go to Underdog. Let's make some picks. Russell Wilson has been at 264 and 278 passing yards over his first two games. Washington has seen quarterbacks throw 36 more yards in their season-long average against them. Now, obviously, season-long average-wise, Russell Wilson doesn't have a big sample. But let's still go with Russell Wilson higher than 226.5 yards. And then let's go higher than 28.5 receiving yards for Rashad Bateman. That's a number that he's basically gotten to in all but 2 games this year. His lowest has been 23 yards. Now, I don't know how much Deontay Johnson's going to end up playing, but we'll see. I think it's still a logical play. Now, you can make those picks too if you want. Just head to underdogfantasy.com and sign up. And when you sign up, make sure you use promo code LATEROUND. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I got a mailbag episode dropping tomorrow and then another episode of Late Round Perspectives. I'll talk to you then.